today I'm going to be presenting a piece that came out in the journal Poetics in February. So it's done in a sense, but it's part of a book project I'm working on social reproduction and mobility among middle-class adults in Santiago. And that book is going to be focusing on housing, school choice, aesthetic taste, and cultural consumption. And so I'm really trying to think about class mobility and class reproduction in these different fields. And so I really would appreciate, even though this is a published article, if you have suggestions about how to revise it, because it will eventually become a chapter, and any other suggestions about the project, that would be very helpful. So I'm going to start with Pierre Bourdieu's work. His study of the transformation of the housing field invites an exploration of demand, and I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the blind spot or the lacuna in that a very interesting book. And so the research question that I start out with is, how do middle-class families access housing, and what housing tastes do their choices reflect? Okay, and my answer to that question builds on interviews with 77 middle-class adults in 2 Santiago, Chile communities. And in that research, I depart from the rational actor model of much housing research to focus on 2 areas. The concept of housing pathways, how families endowed with different forms of capital move through the housing market, and elective belonging, in which middle-class families select aesthetically appealing homes and communities with little regard for long-term inhabitants. The findings, I'll argue, highlight the importance of capital for housing access and of extended family as a resource for both housing access and neighborhood selection. Okay, so why would we want to look at middle classes and housing in Chile? I think there are a couple of very interesting reasons, okay? Chile, as some of you may know, adopted a free market approach not just to macroeconomics, but also to housing. And I'll talk a little bit more about the details of that in a minute. And that model then got diffused to Colombia and South Africa and perhaps other places. So looking carefully at the Chilean case will have important comparative implications that are worthy of note. And likewise, Chile, as is true in many Latin American countries in the 90s and 2000s, has witnessed the numerical growth and the structural transformation of its middle classes. And one just little data point here, between 2011 and 2013, there was a big increase in the lower middle class. And so when I started this research, a lot of people were interested in how is this playing into the rise of the right in Chile. Piñera's election in 2010 and maybe re-election in the upcoming presidential elections. And so it's a political import, and while it's not the focus of my talk, those of you who know Chilean history know that the middle class has actually played a very critical role at various political junctures in Chile's history. Okay, so looking in a little more detail at the reform of the housing market beginning in the late 1970s, we have the creation of a mortgage market, land use deregulation, and targeted home subsidies, as well as downtown redevelopment. And they had some important implications for changes in the structure of housing in Santiago and other cities, as well as changes in the kinds of housing middle-class people were accessing. So the social housing model really pushed ghettos out to the urban periphery, and so it created a kind of a spatial mismatch between poor people and jobs. A lot of people have written about that. The relaxation of regulation over building, especially kind of outside Américo Vespucio, for those of you who know Santiago, sort of on the periphery of the city, permitted the building of shopping malls, big box stores, and very large gated communities. And so that created kind of a new pattern of suburbanization, which was different from the historical, what's called the cono de alta renta, sort of in this area. And then finally, the subsidies for downtown redevelopment that were specifically targeted towards the middle class led to a very significant boom in apartment construction in some of the central municipalities of Santiago. So the dark blue dots are the most recent, that's 2011. And so if you look going back to 2007, The construction projects are very spread out, but if you move to 2011, they're all converging on the center of Santiago. And so that obviously has implications for kind of the spatial organization of housing for middle-class families, as well as kind of the types of housing people are living in. Much more of a shift towards apartments, which was a pretty small piece of the housing sector in the past. So in the study, I compare a sort of a traditional high cultural capital middle-class community in Ñuñoa, and I'll show you a map a little bit later. And so on the top, you see a picture of the Plaza Ñuñoa, which is kind of this iconic plaza in Santiago, and there's a bike rental thing, which is very apropos for the community and its vibe, if you will. And an emerging middle-class suburb, La Florida, which was really rural until the late 1970s when there were some projects to build blue-collar housing, and then later kind of a middle class emerged there. And then we have a skate park, so kind of the idea of, the teenagers are getting out of control, we better find a place to contain them so that they can ride their skateboards and not, crash into cars or something like that. And so looking at these two communities, I think, provides a nice opportunity to observe vertical and horizontal divisions between middle-class fractions, which is something I'm trying to get at, and the implications of that for social reproduction and social mobility. Okay, so here's the argument, as sometimes we run out of time and we don't get to make it, so I try and give it in the beginning. So first, about housing access, I argue that families' differential access to savings, public subsidies, and mortgages lead them to follow linear, chaotic, progressive, and reproductive housing pathways. And I'll talk in a minute about this idea of housing pathways and those specific variants. And with regard to taste, in Chile, middle classes display a distinct pattern of neighborhood taste from that found in a very well-known study in Manchester, UK, called Globalization and Belonging. In addition to settlement and aesthetically pleasing neighborhoods or areas with high-performing schools, which sort of fits this model of elective belonging, some middle-class families follow extended family members to specific neighborhoods or seek out urban villages, as found in a very large multi-neighborhood study of Paris and London, okay? Some convergence and some divergence. Now, this latter pattern, interestingly, mirrors working class informants in the United Kingdom. So sort of how middle classes and working classes are interacting with housing, is varying cross-nationally. And so that, I think, theoretically is an interesting finding. And finally, I think the most important thing here is that the findings on housing access and neighborhood taste highlight the importance of extended family for housing selection. And so this really takes us away from a lot of the work on contemporary Chile that's telling us that individualization is this master process. The BNUD sort of came up with this idea in the late 90s, and it's sort of diffused through the social science that Chileans are becoming more individualistic and the markets are eating away at tradition, and I'm not seeing that in this sample. And so that's an interesting counterpoint to some of the generalizations that have been made in the last couple of decades. So let's walk through some of the theoretical material that I'm drawing on. So Bourdieu developed the concepts of capital as a fungible resource actors accumulate, exchange, and convert for personal advantage. So economic capital obviously is not something that he originated, but he also developed a concept of cultural capital, which refers to both formal knowledge and manners, linguistic knowledge that's developed in the family and in school, social capital referring to social networks and reputation, and symbolic capital referring to status. And so basically the idea is that individuals are parlaying these different types of resources to gain access to jobs, status, connections, and so on, and sometimes converting one form to another can be advantageous. He also develops the concept of habitus as a set of durable, transposable dispositions acquired in the family and to a lesser extent further on in life, and field as an arena of competition among actors accepting common rules but differing in capital portfolios, habitus, and strategies. So kind of the model here is that material and symbolic inequalities are reproduced through conflicts within fields between actors with different habituses and capital portfolios. So basically, we have these constant conflicts going on between actors with different endowments of capital within specific fields, and the outcomes of those conflicts either reproduce or transform systems of inequality and social ranking. Now, he's best known, at least in my discipline of sociology, in applying these concepts in the education, cultural consumption, and artistic fields. However, one of his last studies focused on the housing field in France. And there, he argued that the housing market was shaped by compromises among differently positioned state actors. Namely, there was a battle between those government entities that were married to the social housing model and other actors that were interested in bringing the market, builders and banks and so on, bringing the market principle more into housing. So he argued that ultimately the imposition of the American model of the long-term mortgage caused social suffering among middle-class families. It was kind of a swindle against them in the sense that people were shackled to long-term mortgages, and they faced these very untenable trade-offs between bad housing that's centrally located and higher quality housing that's way too far from work and the city. He argued that, and this is sort of an interesting contrast with what I found in Chile, that mortgage financing replaced the traditional pattern of family inheritance and eroded the modern model of social housing. And there's some other scholars that look at the emergence of mortgages in Western Europe in particular to making a similar kind of argument. So in his book, and I don't remember the exact year, but he found that something like 9% of the survey respondents relied on inheritance as their main way to access housing. Okay, so that's a big shift. Super interesting book. However, oddly, given that he looked so much at consumption and demand in his other studies, not a whole lot of analysis of home buyers in this book. But he gives us a toolkit that could be applied to home buyers, and that's sort of where I take off with this study. Now, some other scholars more recently have tried to use these concepts of capital and habitus and field to look at home buyers and those seeking housing. So a couple of interesting studies on the Netherlands looks at young adults trying to access housing, and specifically their use of different forms of capital to access it. And so these authors identify 3 housing pathways: a linear pathway in which individuals use long-term planning to access permanent housing, and these tend to be people who are more affluent, have more access to family support, and so on. Chaotic progressive pathways in which individuals use social and cultural capital to access temporary housing in symbolically attractive communities and later access permanent housing. And so here the prototype is kind of the foot soldier of gentrification, the artist or the gay or lesbian person that moves into a rundown neighborhood that's symbolically attractive, builds some status or some resources, and then is able to access permanent housing. And finally, in reproductive pathways, individuals lack the resources or skills to plan ahead, and they're cycling through multiple temporary arrangements. However, they're still relying on social and cultural capital to engage in sort of periodic crisis management, moving from one place that they're getting evicted from to another. Now, there's a couple of interesting studies of housing in Italy and Russia that really fit with what I was finding in Chile, in that they argue that where mortgage markets are either weakly developed or relatively new, extended family resources become crucial to financing housing. And particularly the Italy study by Poggio looks at all the panoply of resources that families might lend to adult progeny, anything from labor to capital to giving them a house and so on. So very interesting. So we have this kind of idea that before mortgage markets take over, family is kind of like the crucial means of financing housing or accessing housing. However, recently, as a consequence of the overheated markets in Western Europe and the United States and other places, as well as the credit crunch that followed the Great Recession, particularly affluent young adults are once again turning to families to finance housing. Okay, so it's coming back in a very different context. So that's kind of the framework that I'm starting with to look at housing access, and I want to turn now to housing taste. So Mike Savage and co-authors developed a very interesting concept of elective belonging. And the idea here is that middle-class families are seeking aesthetically pleasing neighborhoods and claiming moral ownership of these communities in contrast to long-term residents. And so the idea is that, oh, I find this place to be beautiful because it has a pastoral landscape, and because I grew up in a pastoral landscape, it connects to my biography, but I could care less about all the people who grew up here, right? And what makes me more worthy of living here is the fact that I've connected it to my biography. So it's a very negative view of the middle classes and the way that they're moving through the housing markets in Manchester. And then in a later study, Savage develops a contrasting principle of dwelling, which he connects to some working class residents, where he found that individuals are loyal to their homes and communities where they were born and bred. So much more of a connection, much more of a sense of roots than a sense of the search for the perfect neighborhood and home. So I'll come back to this idea of elective belonging and talk about how it fits in some ways with the data that I found, and in other ways, not as much. Okay, I want to take a minute to just say a little bit about what some Latin Americanist and Latin American scholars have said about housing and how this may inform the study, and then I want to move on to research design and so on. So there's a lot of work on gated communities, and sort of two arguments about them. One is that gated communities are settings where middle-class people are fleeing from crime. They want a nostalgic alternative to city life. They want to be around people like them. But on the other hand, some other scholars have argued that these gated communities, which oftentimes are built in what in Chile would be poblaciones, poor communities, the individuals that end up moving into these gated communities develop a whole set of connections to pre-existing residents. So sort of a contrasting interpretation. A couple of other studies on Montevideo and Buenos Aires argue that gated community residents may seek pastoral suburban landscapes. It's really kind of a lifestyle choice. Or they're trying to punch their way into the elite by moving into these gated communities. They're trying to crack into this exclusive social circle. Some work on middle classes in Chile argues that the middle class is divided in its preferences for Central European-style urban neighborhoods and American-style suburbs, reflecting moral boundaries between different segments of the middle classes. And this is going to be interesting in comparing these two communities that we'll be talking about in a moment. So I just went 2 slides ahead. So I'm going to be focusing on housing access and taste, and I will argue that this reveals many of the material and symbolic boundaries separating different middle class fractions. Just a quick sketch of Chile's middle classes. There's much more to say, but just a little bit of background. Really, what I want to emphasize here, and I'm not going to go minutely through this, is that we have a broad shift from a kind of a Keynesian middle class, if you will, a middle class that is primarily in the civil service sector from the 20s until the 70s, to a much more neoliberal middle class, much more involved in private business, freelancing, own account employment, and that obviously results from the familiar market-based reforms that happened under Pinochet and the Chilean model and so on. The other thing that probably is familiar to many of you is that Chile has a very rigid income structure. The distance between the top and the bottom hasn't really changed in the last 20, 25 years, but there's some play in the middle of the distribution, and so that makes it interesting for looking at the middle classes. So Lots of people write about middle classes. No one has come up with a satisfactory definition of middle classes. I am not going to come up with a satisfactory definition of middle classes, but I do want to tell you a little bit about how I operationalize the people that I study. So the upper middle class I define as college-educated individuals with incomes in the 60th to 90th percentile of the distribution, and lower middle class as individuals with a high school education. Some had technical degrees. Very few were downwardly mobile who had university degrees with incomes between the 40th and 50th percentiles of distribution. I conducted 68 semi-structured interviews with 77 adults aged 36 to 59. Most of them were in their mid-40s. I started out with a snowball sample, followed by focused research with parents in traditional Catholic and secular alternative schools in both La Florida and Ñuñoa. As I mentioned before, Ñuñoa is sort of a traditional middle-class area, a lot of cultural institutions, higher educational levels. La Florida is more of a new middle-class district with upwardly mobile, privately employed individuals. A quick map of Santiago, you can see that Ñuñoa is very convenient for downtown Santiago, very close in, and also part of this cono de alta renta, which historically was kind of the center of the middle and upper classes. La Florida is further out. It's closer to the Andes Mountains, so some people like what they call the pure air. I don't think there's any pure air in Santiago, but anyway. Yeah. If it works for them, it's great. Just another little indicator that gives you a sense of sort of the income distributions. The thing I want to emphasize for you here is Ñuñoa. About 75% of the population is in the middle class quintiles. A very minute poor population. If we look at La Florida, around 55% is within these three quintiles that would be considered middle and upper class. 30% is working class, and 6% is poor. And so that obviously is going to lead to some differences in terms of cross-class encounters and the identity of the community and so on. The interviews that I conducted focused on family, occupational, and educational histories and investments in housing, home decoration, leisure, and educational fields. I also photographed about half of the sample, 31 living rooms, so I have that sort of material culture database to work with. Conducted participant observation at school and social events. I used modified grounded theory approach to code and interpret the data. Shifted from open coding to analytical codes, which is kind of the common approach. However, I depart from grounded theory in that it's not a purely inductive study. I started out with a set of theoretical questions, and really, so it would be more similar to what Reagan and Amoroso called retroduction, sort of tacking back and forth between theory and data, or the extended case method of Michael Brevoy, which is using ethnographic data to kind of refine and expand existing theories. Okay, to the findings. Let's first talk about housing access. Families follow distinct pathways based on differential access to wealth. However, across these different pathways, they rely on family support and social and cultural capital access housing. So there's some differences, but also some similarities that cross over. In linear pathways, individuals access permanent housing via savings or homes gifted by parents. So here's Jimena, software engineer. She says, my dad did well for himself, thank God, and he bought a house for each of his 4 daughters. He did more than a father needs to do. My parents helped me select the house, especially my mom, who has always lived in Ñuñoa. We found a house in a quiet area near the supermarket in my siblings' homes. So you think about, you're getting gifted a house, and that means that you can potentially buy something else and use it as an investment property, and that automatically puts you way head and shoulders above other folks in terms of your sustainability as a family and also your capacity to accumulate wealth. The other thing which I think is interesting in this excerpt is that we see how the mother is providing insider knowledge about the housing market, and so we have the transmission of cultural capital across generations. In chaotic progressive pathways, individuals may cycle in and out of the parental home due to job loss or divorce, but eventually access permanent housing with parental support or subsidies. So Pasi, who's a pharma salesperson, remarks, I lost my job and moved in with my parents. I rented out my house, and then when I got another job, I rented an apartment because it's safer for my daughters when I travel for work. Now that I am in a stable relationship, I want to return to the house with my partner. So this was in fact very common because there's no job security in Chile, and Most people who work in the Chilean labor force do not have long-term contracts. And so people are getting and losing jobs, and so they have to figure out, they have to scramble when they lose their job, and oftentimes they're back to the parental home. Additionally, restrictive lending policies that have a minimum 75 to 80% loan-to-value ratio and a maximum of 25% of income spent on payments means that those who do not have family capital get slotted into specific communities, which may not be where they necessarily want to move. But it's a policy that's set up to protect banks, essentially. It's very restrictive if you don't have a lot of savings on hand. So Rosanna, it was a retail clerk, argues comments, I should say, when we decided to save for a house, we applied for subsidy and qualified for homes in La Florida and Maipú. When we bought our house, the company hadn't finished one of the bedrooms, so we had to insulate it and finish it. So these folks, are at the mercy of unscrupulous builders and so on. In reproductive pathways, some lower middle class residents chose to remain in the family home, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment, while others lacked the resources to access independent housing. So here's Anil Wap, a freelance graphic designer. She's experienced downward mobility. She says, my youngest daughter and I live with my aunt who owns this apartment, so I don't pay rent. She also helps pay my daughter's school tuition. Since my income varies each month and I need to spread it out among my 4 children, it's still difficult. So now I want to shift over to housing tastes. Upper middle class families alternately seek to display cultural capital, accumulate social capital, or reproduce cultural capital via their children. These variations highlight moral aesthetic boundaries across families. And what I mean by that is that I could not identify a clear pattern that said that you're in this occupational group with this level of education and you get slotted into displaying cultural capital, whereas you're in this other occupational group with this other educational background and you choose to reproduce cultural capital. So there was no clear middle class segment that went in any of these one paths. That's more diffuse. And here we're talking specifically about upper middle class. So the first and third patterns fit the elective belonging model, but the second contradicts it, pointing to important cross-cultural variations in middle classes that I touched on in the beginning. Downwardly mobile lower middle class families evidence what Bourdieu called the taste for necessity, really looking at the working class, while lifelong members display what Mike Savage calls dwelling, expressing an attachment to childhood homes, landscapes, and kin. So in displaying cultural capital, some seek functional amenities like good transit, services, while others highlight aesthetic features of neighborhoods. So Gladys, a graphic designer, comments, we wanted a house with a reasonably large yard. We looked in Ñuñoa, but the houses were too old and needed work. The houses were too expensive in Peñalolén, and then we found this place in La Florida. I needed a yard because I love to play with the dogs. Batika, who is an artist and NGO employee, comments, and she lives in Ñuñoa, where we live is still a neighborhood. It has produce stores, people walking their dogs, parks, bars, and several of my friends live here. I'd like to be able to walk to Providencia to all the stores. The area is quiet, welcoming, and has personality. In accumulating social capital, others desire to live in an urban village with trust-based ties to neighbors or to live near extended family. So Patricia, who is an assistant to a businessman, remarks, the people on the corner recognize my kids and know their minds, so if they saw them with other adults, they would say something. I can call the greengrocer and order some vegetables, and he'll deliver them. Claudia, a psychologist, comments, I decided to buy an apartment on the Plaza Ñuñoa. I've lived here all my life, so it's all very familiar. I really wanted to be close to my family, and I bought an apartment that is midway between my mother's house and my children's school. And finally, in social reproduction, a third group settled near high-performing schools to prioritize children's educational opportunities. Quality private and charter schools are often oversubscribed, and the former use tests prior to admission, so parents freak out a lot about where their kids are going to end up going to school, and oftentimes will opt to get into a school first before they decide where to live. And I've written a little about this, so I can talk about the kind of the school scene later if you're interested. So Letta, a physical therapist, comments, we selected our children's school first and then found a home nearby afterward. We often host our children's class parties at our home. That way we can get to know the other parents so that if there's ever a problem, they can help us out. when I shift to lower middle class families. Okay, so one pattern was a taste for necessity. So downwardly mobile families express resignation about their limited options. So Marcella, who's a truck driver, comments, the neighborhood's pretty safe. I'm close to the subway, supermarket, and mall. The problem I had was that I didn't have the luxury of looking for houses in different comunas. Macul and La Florida were unattainable. In contrast is the pattern of dwelling. Those raised in families with modest incomes express attachment to their childhood homes, neighborhoods, and kin. So Yvonne, who works for a direct selling company, comments, I've spent my whole life here. I know all the neighbors, the homes are large, I'm right next to the mountains, I wouldn't live anywhere else. And Alejandra, who's a teacher's aide, comments, I have fond memories of my childhood. My dad used to take us and our friends hiking in the mountains so we could collect grass to feed our bunnies. The local farmers allowed us to milk their cows. They would show us how to do it and then sell us the milk. So to conclude, I've argued that diverse housing pathways reflect distinct endowments of capital across families and help explain unequal access to housing and attractive neighborhoods. Some patterns of upper middle class housing taste reflect elective belonging, while others evidence a traditional connection to family and neighborhood. The absence of choice that's evident among lower middle class families highlights vertical divisions within the middle class, as well as an inherited working class habitus among those who are not downwardly mobile. Patterns of housing access and taste evidence the centrality of extended family to financing home purchases and guiding neighborhood selection. This diverges from the prediction that the mortgage market would lead to a decline of inheritance as a means of housing access. It is also similar to the rising importance of family wealth for housing access in the global north, but it does not result from an overheated housing market or a credit crunch. Rather, prices in Santiago are relatively modest, topping out at around $40,000 US for most homes. And the prices have been relatively stable over recent decades in Santiago. So in this regard, Chile follows the Southern European pattern of the intergenerational transmission of home ownership. Finally, the role of extended family qualifies the common view, and the Payne was sort of the first to put this out in the Chilean context, that individualization is a dominant societal pattern in Chile. So if we're arguing that traditions are falling by the wayside and individual adults are making their own choices, they're charting their own paths, that doesn't really jibe with people turning to mom and dad to, give them a house or help them find a house, or they're moving near mom and dad to be in the same neighborhood. Okay. A couple other pieces from this project. There's a piece on school choice, kind of an overview piece I did early in the project. A blog piece on aesthetic taste in the living room, and I have a longer unpublished chapter that looks at both visual art and sort of decorative objects in the home. And then a couple of other areas that I've worked in that Josh mentioned. This book, The Sociology of Consumption, builds on a lot of research that I did in Santiago on shoppers and vendors in street markets, flea markets, and malls. Has a focus on the global south, but also looks at inequalities and consumer citizenship. This is a book I co-edited with a couple of Chilean colleagues, a collection of some recent work on labor in Chile. I published several articles on metalworkers' mobilization in democracy and dictatorship and post-dictatorship. There's a piece that came out this year in Latin American Politics and Society that kind of summarizes that work. And then I've also done some comparative work, so collaborated with Chris Tilley and Sarah Mosuetza on a special issue in International Labor and Working Class History last year on precarious work in the Global South. And thanks very much.